What would you do if everything you've worked for your entire life could be destroyed in the next 90 minutes? The silence in Carnegie Hall's backstage was suffocating. The kind of silence that screams louder than any orchestra ever could. In exactly 2 hours, the most anticipated concert of the year would begin. Tickets had sold out in minutes. Critics from every major publication had flown in. The pianist performing tonight had a reputation that could make or break careers. And the $2 million Steinway grand piano was broken. Standing before that magnificent instrument was a man nobody expected to see there. Darius Webb, 67 years old, blind since birth. A janitor who'd spent 22 years cleaning these very halls, invisible to almost everyone who walked past him. His weathered hands, calloused from decades of pushing mops and carrying trash, trembled slightly as they reached toward the ivory keys. Around him, a semicircle of suits and skeptical faces watched with barely concealed doubt. The stage manager checked his watch for the 100th time. The conductor's arms were crossed, his expression a mixture of desperation and disbelief. The hall's director stood rigid, trying to maintain composure, while his entire career hung in the balance. Could a blind janitor really save a $2 million piano? Would anyone actually believe him? And perhaps most importantly, how did he even end up in this room, in this moment, with everything riding on his next move? Darius pressed the first key. The note rang out pure and clear, filling the space with a sound that seemed to suspend time itself. Someone in the room inhaled sharply. Another leaned forward, listening with sudden, intense focus. But to understand what was really happening in that moment, to grasp the weight of what Darius was about to do, we need to go back. Back 22 years to a cold November morning, when Darius first walked through Carnegie Hall's service entrance, believing he'd found nothing more than a job that would pay the bills. Back even further to a small house in rural Georgia, where a blind child first discovered that darkness couldn't dim the one gift he'd been given. This is the story of how one man's hidden talent, buried for half a century under layers of necessity and survival, would surface in the most unlikely moment to save not just a concert, but to prove something far more important about dignity, worth, and the gifts we carry in silence. Carnegie Hall, on a Friday evening in October, was always electric with anticipation. But tonight, the energy was different. Tonight was special. Tonight, the legendary pianist Victoria Brennan would perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, a piece so technically demanding, so emotionally complex, that only a handful of pianists in the world dared to attempt it in Carnegie Hall. The ticket prices reflected the occasion. Front row seats had gone for $1,500. The balcony was packed with music students who'd saved for months just to be in the building. Major publications had sent their most respected critics. This wasn't just a concert. It was an event that would be discussed, analyzed, and remembered for years, which made what happened at 5:30 that evening, exactly 2 hours before curtain, so catastrophic. James Morrison, Carnegie Hall's head stage manager for the past 18 years, was doing his standard pre-show checks. He'd done these hundreds of times. Lights, sound, system, stage positioning, and finally the piano. The Steinway Model D grand piano. All 9 feet of ebony perfection, valued at $2 million, was the crown jewel of the Hall's collection. It had been played by legends. Its tone was described in reverent whispers by musicians who'd had the privilege of touching its keys. James approached the piano, as he always did, running through his mental checklist. He pressed middle C, expecting the familiar, perfect resonance. Instead, the note that emerged was wrong. Subtly wrong, but unmistakably wrong. His stomach tightened. He pressed D. Wrong again. E. Also off. His hands moved faster now, working up and down the keyboard. Nearly a third of the keys were producing notes that were flat or sharp, some by just a few cents, others more noticeably. Individually, most audience members might not consciously notice. But together, in a complex piece like Rachmaninoff, Victoria Brennan would hear it immediately. The critics would hear it. The performance would be ruined. James pulled out his phone with shaking hands and immediately called the piano technician who'd serviced the Steinway just 3 days ago. Voicemail. He tried the backup technician. No answer. The third technician on their list was out of state at a conference. The fourth was in surgery, his wife explained apologetically. By 6 o'clock, James had called 17 different piano technicians in the New York area. 3 were already committed to other events. 5 didn't answer. The rest either couldn't get there in time, or upon hearing it, was Carnegie Hall's Steinway, admitted they weren't qualified to work on an instrument of that caliber and value. The conductor, Maestro Bernard Foster, arrived at 6:15 for his final run-through. He was known for his precision, his exacting standards, and his ability to hear imperfections that others missed. When James explained the situation, Bernard went pale. He walked to the piano, played a few measures of the Rachmaninoff, and stopped. The dissonance was unmistakable. "We have to cancel," Bernard said, his voice hollow. "There's no other option." "We can't cancel," countered Helen Rodriguez, the hall's executive director, who'd rushed over the moment she heard. "Do you understand what that would mean? The financial loss alone would be devastating, but the damage to our reputation. Victoria Brennan's reputation. We'd be issuing refunds to 2,800 people. We'd be explaining to the press why Carnegie Hall couldn't maintain its most important instrument. This can't happen. Then what do you suggest?" Bernard's frustration was evident. "Should I conduct while the piano plays wrong notes? Should we ask one of the greatest pianists of our generation to perform on a broken instrument?" The argument continued, voices rising, stress fracturing the usual professionalism. Staff members gathered at a distance, whispering among themselves, checking their own phones to see if they could find someone, anyone who could help. It was 7 o'clock now. 1 hour until doors opened. 90 minutes until the performance began. In the hallway outside the concert hall, pushing his cleaning cart past the controlled chaos, Darius Webb moved slowly and methodically, as he always did. His white cane swept in practiced arcs ahead of him. After 22 years, he knew every inch of these halls. Every turn, every doorway, every slight change in floor texture that told him exactly where he was. He'd been cleaning Carnegie Hall since he was 45 years old. Before that, he'd worked as a dishwasher, a factory worker, a night security guard. Whatever jobs were available to a blind man with limited education and no connections. The Carnegie Hall position had been a gift, relatively speaking. The pay was modest but steady. The work was dignified. He could do it well. And every night after the concerts ended and the audiences left, he got to be alone in one of the world's most famous music venues, surrounded by the lingering resonance of beauty. Tonight, as he cleaned the hallway near the stage entrance, he could hear the argument, the panic in their voices, the desperate phone calls. And he heard something else too, something the others probably couldn't perceive. Through the partially open stage door, he could hear Maestro Bernard Foster playing the piano, testing keys, the notes falling wrong, discordant, each one slightly off pitch. Darius stopped. His hands gripped the handle of his cleaning cart. He listened with an intensity that went beyond mere hearing. Listened with the part of him that had been both his greatest gift and his heaviest burden for 67 years. He knew those wrong notes. He could hear exactly how wrong they were. D-flat was 8 cents flat. F-sharp was 12 cents sharp. B was 6 cents flat. He could hear them all, could map them in his mind like a constellation of imperfection against what should have been perfect. And he knew with absolute certainty that he could fix them. For several long moments, Darius stood frozen in that hallway, his heart pounding against his ribs. 22 years he'd worked here. 22 years of being invisible, of being the man who cleaned up after everyone left, of being the blind janitor nobody really saw or spoke to beyond polite hellos. 22 years of keeping his gift hidden, of never mentioning that he could hear things others couldn't, of protecting himself from disappointment and rejection. But now listening to that beautiful piano crying out its wrong notes, listening to the desperation in the voices of people who had no solution, Darius felt something shift inside him. A memory surfaced clear as yesterday, despite the decades. His mother's voice, gentle but firm, her hands guiding his small fingers to the keys of their old upright piano in rural Georgia. "Your gift is meant to be shared, Darius," she'd told him when he was just 6 years old, when they'd discovered that he could identify any note, any interval, any chord with perfect accuracy, despite never being able to see the keys. God doesn't give us talents to hide. He gives them to us to help others. Darius took a deep breath. His hands were shaking. His mouth was dry. Every instinct told him to keep pushing his cart, to mind his own business, to stay in his lane like he'd done for 22 years. But he couldn't. Not tonight. Not when he could help. Not when his mother's words echoed so loudly in his mind. Slowly, carefully, Darius turned his cart around and made his way toward the stage entrance. To understand what Darius was about to do, to understand the magnitude of the moment he was walking into, we need to go back further. Back to where it all began, in a place far removed from the marble halls and velvet seats of Carnegie Hall. Darius Webb was born in the summer of 1956 in a small town outside Augusta, Georgia. He was born blind, the doctors told his parents, due to a congenital condition that couldn't be fixed. For his mother, Clara Webb, a woman of deep faith and deeper determination, this diagnosis was not the end of her son's possibilities. It was simply a different beginning. Clara worked as a vocal director at their local church. She led the choir, taught private voice lessons to supplement the family's income, and filled their small house with music from morning until night. Clara believed that music could open doors that sight could not. That sound could paint pictures more vivid than anything eyes could see. When Darius was 4 years old, Clara began teaching him piano. Not because she expected him to become a concert pianist, but because she wanted him to have something beautiful in his life, something he could create and control in a world that would often try to limit him. The old upright piano in their living room became Darius's universe. While other children learned about the world through pictures and television, Darius learned through intervals and chords, through the way harmonies resolved and melodies developed. His small fingers would trace the keys for hours, and Clara would sit beside him, patient and encouraging, teaching him not just notes, but the language of music itself. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the spring when Darius was 6 years old that Clara discovered her son's extraordinary gift. She'd been working with one of her voice students, a teenager preparing for a school musical. The student was struggling to find the right pitch, singing consistently flat. Clara moved to the piano to play the correct note as a reference. Before she could press the key, Darius, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up in his small voice. "She's singing E flat, Mama. She needs to sing E." Clara froze. She pressed the keys. He was exactly right. "Darius," she said carefully, her heart beginning to race. "What note am I playing now?" She pressed a key without telling him which one. "G." he said immediately. She pressed another. B flat. Another. D sharp. She played a chord. He named every note. She played a complex progression. He identified each chord by name. Clara's hands were shaking by the end of the test. Her voice student stared in amazement. Darius simply waited, wondering why his mother had stopped playing. Perfect pitch. The ability to identify or produce any musical note without a reference. Fewer than 1 in 10,000 people possessed it naturally, and her blind 6-year-old son had it in a form so precise, so immediate, that he could hear the difference between notes that were imperceptibly close. From that day forward, Clara poured everything she had into developing Darius's gift. She found books about music theory at the library and read them to him. She taught him about interval scales, harmony composition. She borrowed teaching materials from the local high school. She connected with a music professor at Augusta University who agreed to give Darius lessons twice a month, fascinated by this blind child who could hear what trained musicians spent years learning to distinguish. By the time Darius was 10 years old, he could sit at a piano and tune it by ear, adjusting strings until each note rang with perfect pitch. He could listen to a symphony and transcribe every instrument's part. He could hear a piece of music once and play it back from memory, note perfect. His mother's dream grew with his abilities. She began to imagine a future for him at a prestigious music conservatory, perhaps Juilliard or Berkeley, where his gift would be recognized and cultivated. But dreams, especially dreams built by poor families in small southern towns, are fragile things. Darius was 14 when his mother died. It was sudden. A heart attack while she was directing choir practice. She was 42 years old. One moment she was raising her hands to bring in the sopranos, the next she was gone. The funeral was held at the church where she'd spent so many years filling the space with music. Darius sat in the front pew, his father's hand on his shoulder, and listened to the choir singing hymns that his mother had taught them. Every note was slightly wrong now, slightly flat or sharp without her there to guide them. He heard every imperfection, and each one felt like another piece of his heart breaking. After the funeral, reality settled in with crushing weight. Darius's father, Robert Webb, worked at a textile mill. The pay was barely enough to keep them housed and fed, even when Clara was contributing income from her music lessons. Now, with her gone, they were drowning. The mortgage was behind. Bills piled up. The electricity was shut off twice. Food became scarce enough that Darius often went to bed hungry. The expensive books Clara had bought about music theory were sold at a yard sale. The arrangements she'd made for Darius's lessons evaporated. The music professor from Augusta University called once, offering to continue working with Darius for free, but Robert couldn't afford the gas money to drive him there twice a month. At 15, Darius dropped out of school to work. There weren't many jobs available for a blind teenager with no diploma, but he found work washing dishes at a diner in town. $6 an hour, 40 hours a week, if he was lucky. He'd stand at that sink for 8 hours, hands in scalding water, listening to the clatter and conversation of a world he couldn't see, and he'd remember his mother's piano. The old upright stayed in their living room for another year before his father sold it. They needed the money, Robert explained, with genuine regret in his voice. Darius understood. He told his father it was okay. But the morning after the piano was picked up, Darius woke to a silence that felt like death itself. The space where the piano had been was empty in a way that went beyond physical absence. For the next 30 years, Darius survived. That's the only word for it. He worked jobs that were available to him. Dishwasher, night janitor at a factory, security guard at a warehouse where he mostly sat alone in the dark for hours. He learned to navigate each new workplace, to be reliable and uncomplaining, to be grateful for any employment at all. He sent money to his father until the old man died when Darius was 38. After that, Darius was alone. But music never left him. It couldn't. His perfect pitch wasn't something he could turn off. He heard the world in notes and intervals. The hum of a refrigerator was B-flat. The beep of a crosswalk signal was F-sharp. The rumble of a subway train contained dozens of frequencies he could identify and name. It was a gift he couldn't use, a talent that had nowhere to go, a constant reminder of the life his mother had imagined for him that would never exist. By the time he was 45, Darius had moved to New York City. It wasn't a choice made with hope or ambition. He'd simply run out of options in Georgia, and New York was said to have more opportunities even for people like him. He lived in a tiny apartment in the Bronx, barely bigger than a closet, and applied for every job he could find. The Carnegie Hall maintenance position came to him through a placement agency that specialized in finding employment for people with disabilities. The pay was $12 an hour. The work was straightforward: empty trash cans, mop floors, clean restrooms, wipe down surfaces. The halls were beautiful, they told him, though of course he couldn't see them. But there were concerts almost every night, they mentioned, and the acoustics were world famous. Darius took the job immediately. His first night at Carnegie Hall, after the audience had left, and the musicians had packed up after the other maintenance workers had finished their tasks in the main areas, Darius was assigned to clean the stage itself. He pushed his mop across the wooden floor, following the pattern he'd been taught, working in the silence that followed great music. And then he heard it. A single note, faint but clear, still resonating in the space. The way sound lingered in this hall was unlike anywhere he'd ever been. The acoustic design allowed notes to bloom and decay with perfect clarity. Standing there on that stage, mop in hand, Darius felt something he hadn't felt in over 30 years. He felt close to his mother again. From that night forward, Darius made a ritual of his work. He'd come in at 10 p.m. after each concert, after the performers and audience were gone. He'd clean the public spaces first. Then, last of all, he'd clean the concert hall itself. And he'd listen. He'd listen to the recordings of what had been performed playing in his memory with perfect clarity. He'd listen to the residual resonance in the space. He'd sometimes touch the piano keys gently as he dusted around the instrument, just feeling the connection to the music that had been played. The other maintenance workers knew him as quiet, reliable, unremarkable. The stage managers and concert coordinators would pass him in the halls with brief nods if they noticed him at all. To everyone at Carnegie Hall, Darius Webb was simply the blind janitor who'd worked there for years, doing his job competently but unremarkably. Nobody knew that he could hear every note of every performance with perfect clarity. Nobody knew that he'd memorized the acoustic properties of the hall so thoroughly he could tell where a musician was standing by the sound of their instrument. Nobody knew that he could identify the exact make and model of any piano brought in just by hearing a few notes played. And nobody knew that sometimes late at night, when he was certain he was alone, Darius would stand at that Steinway grand piano and play. Nothing complex, nothing that would draw attention if someone happened to hear. Just simple melodies, his mother's favorite hymns, pieces from his childhood, just enough to keep that part of him alive, to maintain the connection to the gift she'd given him and the future she'd dreamed of. For 22 years, that's how Darius lived. Working, surviving, staying invisible, keeping his gift hidden like a secret that no longer had any purpose. Until tonight. Until he stood in that hallway and heard a $2 million piano crying out for help, and remembered his mother's words about gifts being meant to be shared. By 7:15, the backstage area of Carnegie Hall had transformed into a pressure cooker of barely controlled panic. James Morrison had stopped making phone calls. There was no one left to call. Maestro Bernard Foster sat on a folding chair, head in his hands, the weight of the impending disaster pressing down on him. Helen Rodriguez was on her phone with Carnegie Hall's board of directors, explaining a situation that had no good explanation. "We'll have to make an announcement," Helen said, her voice tight with stress. "We'll need to start notifying ticket holders. The press will need a statement. Victoria Brennan's management will need to be informed. This will follow us for years," James said quietly. Carnegie Hall, unable to maintain its instruments, unable to deliver on its most important commitment. How do we come back from that? Victoria Brennan herself was in her dressing room, unaware of the catastrophe unfolding. She was in her pre-performance routine, the meditation and mental preparation that had served her throughout her career. In 30 minutes, someone would have to knock on her door and explain that everything had fallen apart. The stage crew stood in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones. Some had already started making calls to other venues they worked at, sensing that Carnegie Hall's reputation was about to take a hit that might affect all their futures. The atmosphere was thick with a kind of collective dread, the feeling of watching something important crumble and being powerless to stop it. It was into this scene that Darius Webb appeared. He came slowly, his white cane tapping ahead of him, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd navigated these spaces thousands of times. The argument died down as people noticed him. There was a moment of confused silence, everyone wondering why the janitor was approaching them instead of staying in the periphery where he belonged. Darius stopped at what he judged to be an appropriate distance. His hands gripped his cane tightly. His heart was hammering so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to retreat, to go back to his cart and his invisibility. But he'd come this far. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Your gift is meant to be shared." "Excuse me," Darius said, his voice rough with nervousness. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think I might be able to help." The silence that followed was loaded with surprise and confusion. Helen Rodriguez looked up from her phone. James Morrison turned, his expression shifting from despair to bewilderment. Maestro Foster raised his head, staring at this unexpected interruption. "Help," Helen said finally. "I'm sorry, but we're dealing with a technical crisis here. Unless you know a piano technician who can materialize in the next hour, I don't think I can tune the piano." Darius said, the words coming out in a rush now that he'd started. "I know that sounds strange, and I understand if you don't believe me, but I can hear what's wrong with it. I can fix it." The reactions ranged from confusion to dismissiveness. James shook his head slightly, already turning away. Maestro Foster's expression was one of pity mixed with irritation at the interruption. Helen opened her mouth to politely dismiss him, but before she could speak, Darius continued, desperation overriding his natural reticence. "I have perfect pitch. I've had it since I was a child. I can hear that your D flat is 8 cents flat. Your F sharp is 12 cents sharp. Your B is 6 cents flat. I can hear all of them. I've been listening to concerts in this hall for 22 years. I know this piano. I know its sound, and I can fix it." This got their attention. Helen exchanged glances with James. Maestro Foster stood up slowly, his expression shifting to something more analytical, more curious. "Perfect pitch," Bernard repeated. You're saying you can identify notes by ear? Yes, sir. And you think you can tune a Steinway Model D grand piano, one of the most complex, sensitive instruments in the world, by ear? I don't think I can, sir. I know I can. I learned to do it when I was 10 years old. I've been listening to pianos my entire life. I can hear exactly what needs to be adjusted. Helen's phone buzzed with another call, but she ignored it. The practicality of their situation was overriding her skepticism. Even if what you're saying is true, she said carefully, even if you have this ability, do you understand the risk? This instrument is worth $2 million. If you damage it, if you make it worse somehow, I won't make it worse, Darius said, his voice steadier now. I understand your concern. I understand this is an extraordinary instrument, but I can help. I'm asking for a chance to prove it. James stepped forward. Prove it how? Test me. Play any notes on the piano. I'll identify them and tell you exactly how far off they are. Then you can decide if you trust me to fix it. The three of them looked at each other. The clock on the wall showed 7:25. 75 minutes until the performance. Helen made a decision. All right, she said. We have nothing to lose at this point. James, take him to the piano. Test him. If he's legitimate, if there's even a chance he can do this, we let him try. As Darius followed James toward the stage, his legs felt weak. His hands trembled. He had kept his gift hidden for so long that revealing it now felt like exposing something deeply private, something vulnerable. But there was also something else growing inside him. A feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. Hope. They reached the piano. Darius could feel the presence of it even before James told him they'd arrived. He could sense the instrument's mass, could hear the subtle sounds of its strings, even when they weren't being played, could feel in his bones the potential of this magnificent creation. It's right in front of you, James said, his voice still carrying doubt, but also a thread of curiosity. I'm going to play notes. You tell me what they are and what's wrong with them. Yes, sir. James pressed a key at random. The note rang out in the empty hall. C sharp, Darius said immediately. Approximately 9 cents sharp. James pulled out his phone, opened a tuner app. He played the note again and watched the readout. His eyes widened slightly. Darius was exactly correct. Try another maestro, Foster said, having followed them to the stage. His tone was less dismissive now, more engaged. James played 5 more notes in different octaves, choosing them randomly. Darius identified each one instantly and specified precisely how many cents, sharp or flat, they were. James checked each one with his tuner app. Every single identification was accurate. By the 6th note, a small crowd had gathered. Other staff members, hearing something unusual was happening, had come to watch. The skepticism was giving way to something else. Amazement. Confusion. A growing sense that they might be witnessing something extraordinary. Helen Rodriguez approached the piano, her phone finally silent in her hand. Mr. Webb, she said, her voice different now, respectful in a way it hadn't been before. Can you actually tune this entire instrument by yourself? In the time we have left? Darius turned in her direction, sensing her position by her voice. Yes, ma'am. I'll need access to the tuning tools, and I'll need people to stay quiet while I work so I can hear properly. But yes, I can do it. How long will it take? 90 minutes? Maybe less. Helen looked at the clock. 7:32. The concert was scheduled to begin at 9. If he was done by 9, they could still start only slightly delayed. They could make an announcement, ask for patience. It was possible, but the risk was enormous. If this blind janitor failed, if he damaged the instrument, or simply couldn't complete the task, they'd be in an even worse position than they were now. They'd have to explain not only why the piano was broken, but why they'd let an untrained maintenance worker attempt to fix it. Helen looked at James, at Bernard, at the gathered staff members. She thought about the millions of dollars at stake, the reputation of Carnegie Hall, the thousands of people who'd bought tickets. Victoria Brennan's career-defining performance, and she thought about this quiet man who'd worked in their building for 22 years, whom she'd probably passed in the hallways hundreds of times without really seeing who was standing here now with trembling hands and determined voice offering to save them all. "Do it," Helen said. "James, get him whatever tools he needs. Everyone else clear the area. Give him space and silence. Mr. Webb, you have until 8:45. That gives us 15 minutes of buffer time. If the piano isn't performance ready by then, we'll have to cancel." "I understand," Darius said. His voice was quiet, but there was certainty in it. "Thank you for trusting me." As James went to retrieve the tuning kit from the storage area, Darius stood alone at the piano for a moment. He ran his hands gently over the keys without pressing them, feeling the cool ivory, the weight of the instrument, the history contained in this beautiful machine. His mother's face appeared in his mind clear as day, despite the decades since he'd last heard her voice. He could almost feel her hand on his shoulder, could almost hear her saying what she'd told him so many times in his childhood. "Your gift is meant to be shared, Darius, not hidden. Shared. I'm sharing it now, Mama," he whispered too quietly for anyone else to hear. "I'm finally sharing it." James returned with the tuning kit, a wooden case containing the specialized tools used to adjust piano strings. He opened it and described the contents to Darius, who nodded, his hands already reaching for the tuning lever with the familiarity of someone who'd done this before, even if it had been many years. "I'm ready," Darius said. The clock read 7:40. He had 65 minutes to save a concert, a reputation, and perhaps in some small way to justify the gift he'd been given 67 years ago. Darius placed the tuning lever on the first pin and began to work. The next 90 minutes would determine everything. But the first 5 minutes would determine whether Darius would be allowed to continue at all. He started with the middle register, specifically with middle C, the reference point from which all other tuning flows. His approach was methodical, but fluid, born from a skill learned so young it was now more instinct than conscious thought. He struck the key, listened to the note with absolute focus, made an adjustment to the tension, struck it again. Another microscopic adjustment. Again. The process looked simple to the observers, but what they couldn't hear was the incredible precision Darius was achieving. Maestro Bernard Foster stood 10 feet away, his arms crossed, his expression intense. He'd spent 40 years around pianos working with the finest piano technicians in the world. He knew what good tuning sounded like, knew the painstaking precision it required. Watching this blind janitor work, he found himself suspended between skepticism and something approaching awe. Darius moved to C sharp. The process repeated. Strike, listen, adjust. Strike, listen, adjust. Each note was brought into perfect alignment with a speed that seemed impossible. There was no hesitation in his movements, no second guessing. He worked with the confidence of absolute certainty. James Morrison stood near the piano, with his tuner app still open, checking each note Darius completed. The readout was showing numbers that made his breath catch. 0 cents deviation. Perfect pitch. Every single note was landing exactly where it should be, with a precision that matched or exceeded the work of the professional technicians they'd had in the past. "My God," James whispered to Helen, who'd come to stand beside him. "He's actually doing it. Every note is perfect." Helen watched Darius work this man she'd seen countless times over the years without ever really looking at. She thought about all the assumptions they'd made, all the ways they'd categorized him as simply the blind janitor, never imagining there might be more to his story. The guilt of that realization mixed with the relief of watching their crisis potentially resolve. After 15 minutes, Darius had completed the middle octave. Maestro Foster finally moved closer. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the keyboard. "Of course," Darius said, stepping back slightly. Bernard sat at the piano and played a complex progression through the octave Darius had just completed. The notes rang out with a clarity and harmony that made several of the watching staff members inhale sharply. The difference was extraordinary. These keys, which had been producing discordant sounds just minutes ago, now sang with perfect resonance. Bernard played the progression again, his experienced ear analyzing every nuance. Then he stood up and looked at Darius with an expression that had transformed from doubt to respect. "Mr. Webb," Bernard said formally, "I apologize for my initial skepticism. What you're doing is remarkable. Please continue. We won't interrupt you again." Darius nodded a small smile, touching his lips. It was the first genuine smile anyone at Carnegie Hall had ever seen from him. "Thank you, Maestro." He returned to work, moving systematically through the keyboard. The gathering of observers had grown. Word was spreading through the building that something extraordinary was happening on the main stage. Stage crew, other maintenance workers, even some of the box office staff had found reasons to pass by and watch for a few moments. They saw a man who moved with absolute confidence despite his blindness, whose hands seemed to know exactly where every key, every pin, every string was located. They saw him work without any visual reference, guided entirely by sound, by touch, by some internal understanding of music that went beyond their comprehension. At 8 o'clock, Victoria Brennan's assistant came looking for James to ask about a scheduling question. She found him standing in the wings watching Darius work. "What's going on?" she whispered. James explained the situation in hushed tones. The assistant's eyes widened. "Should we tell Victoria?" "Not yet," James said. "Let's see if he can finish. No point in worrying her if this doesn't work out." But it was working out. Note by note, key by key, Darius was transforming the broken piano back into the masterpiece it was meant to be. His pace never slowed. His precision never wavered. He'd found a rhythm that allowed him to work both quickly and meticulously, decades of dormant skill awakening, like muscle memory. There were moments of particular difficulty. Some of the pins were stiff, requiring more force to turn. Some strings had tension issues that required multiple adjustments. But Darius worked through each challenge with patient determination. When he encountered a problem, he'd pause, assess, adjust his approach, and continue. At 8:15, he'd completed 3 octaves. At 8:35 octaves. The watching crowd had grown silent, aware they were witnessing something rare and beautiful. There was a reverence in the air, the same kind of reverence that usually accompanied performances on this stage. Helen Rodriguez had been taking periodic calls from board members updating them on the situation. "You're telling me a janitor is tuning the Steinway, one board member said incredulously. "And we're trusting a $2 million instrument to him. I'm telling you that he's already tuned 5 octaves with perfect precision," Helen responded. "And that unless you can produce a certified piano technician in the next 20 minutes, he's our only option." By 8:35, Darius had moved into the final octave. His shirt was damp with sweat. His shoulders ached from the sustained concentration and physical effort, but his hands remained steady. His ear remained perfect. Each note continued to land with absolute precision. James checked the clock. 8:40. 5 minutes ahead of the deadline Helen had set. Around him, the gathered staff members seemed to be holding their collective breath. They could sense the finish line approaching, could feel the potential for something that had seemed impossible an hour ago actually succeeding. Darius struck the final key. A sharp, in the highest octave. He listened, made a minute adjustment, struck it again. Perfect. He sat back slightly, his hands resting on his lap, and took a deep breath. "It's done," he said simply. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Maestro Foster stepped forward and sat at the piano bench. He flexed his fingers, positioned his hands, and began to play. He chose Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, a piece of extraordinary technical and emotional complexity, one that would test every aspect of the piano's tuning and response. The music that poured forth from the Steinway was transcendent. Every note rang with crystalline clarity. The harmonics bloomed and decayed with perfect balance. The instrument sang with a voice that seemed even richer, even more resonant than before. Bernard's hands moved across the keys with increasing confidence, the piece building to its powerful climax, and the piano responded to every nuance, every demand with flawless perfection. When the final notes faded into silence, Bernard sat still for a long moment. Then he stood, turned to face Darius, and began to applaud. The sound of his clapping was immediately joined by James, then Helen, then every person who'd gathered to watch. The applause grew, filling the empty hall with the sound of appreciation and amazement. Darius stood by the piano, his hands clasped in front of him, his face showing a mixture of relief and emotion he couldn't quite hide. He'd done it. After 22 years of invisibility, after 50 years of keeping his gift hidden, he'd done something that mattered. Something that would save this concert and everyone who'd worked so hard to make it happen. Helen Rodriguez approached him, her professional composure cracking slightly to show genuine emotion. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice thick. "I don't have adequate words to thank you. What you've done tonight. You've saved us. You've saved this concert, this institution. I'm in your debt." "I'm just glad I could help, ma'am," Darius said quietly. "Where did you learn to do this?" Bernard asked, coming to stand beside Helen. "To tune with such precision, I've worked with master technicians who couldn't achieve what you just did." Darius was quiet for a moment, deciding how much to share. "My mother taught me," he said finally. "When I was young, before she passed. She believed my gift was meant to be used to help people. Tonight I finally got to honor that." James checked his watch. "It's 8:42. We can start seating the audience. We'll make a brief announcement explaining a slight delay, and we can start the performance at 9:10. Victoria should have just enough time for a quick warm-up with the piano." As the staff dispersed to prepare for the concert, returning to their usual roles with renewed energy and purpose, Darius stood alone by the piano for one more moment. He touched the keys gently one last time, feeling the instrument that had become his connection to his mother, to his past, to the person he might have been in a different life. "Thank you, Mama," he whispered. "I finally shared it." The next hour unfolded with the organized chaos typical of Carnegie Hall, preparing for a major performance. But tonight, there was an additional undercurrent of energy. Word of what had happened with the piano and who had saved the evening spread through the building with remarkable speed. Darius had been ushered to a small backstage office by James Morrison, who insisted he needed to rest after the intense concentration required for the tuning. "The concert is about to start," James said. "I know you usually leave by now, but would you consider staying? I think everyone would like you to be here for this. I don't want to be in the way." Darius responded, still not quite processed to the magnitude of what had shifted in the past 2 hours. Mr. Webb, James said warmly, after what you've done tonight, you couldn't possibly be in the way. In fact, I'm arranging for you to have a seat in the hall itself. Not the usual staff position in the back, a real seat. You deserve to hear this concert the way it's meant to be heard. Darius felt his throat tighten with emotion, and in 22 years of working at Carnegie Hall, he'd never sat in the audience. He'd always experienced concerts as an outsider, cleaning up after everyone had left, listening to echoes and memories. The thought of actually being present, being included, was overwhelming. I would be honored, he said quietly. While Darius waited in the office, the transformation in how others perceived him was continuing throughout the building. Staff members who'd worked alongside him for years, who'd passed him in hallways with barely a nod, suddenly wanted to talk to him, to thank him, to understand who he really was. Maria Santos, who'd worked in the box office for 15 years and had probably seen Darius hundreds of times without really registering his presence, came to the office to meet him properly. Mr. Webb, she said, her voice warm with genuine interest. I heard what you did tonight. It's incredible. I'm embarrassed to say I've worked here all this time and never really spoke with you beyond hello. That's all right, Darius said. I never gave anyone much reason to. Still, Maria said I'd like to change that. After tonight, I think a lot of us would. The interactions continued. People kept finding excuses to stop by to introduce themselves properly, to express their amazement and gratitude. For Darius, who'd spent decades being essentially invisible, the attention was both gratifying and somewhat overwhelming. These people weren't seeing him as the blind janitor anymore. They were seeing him as Darius Webb, master piano tuner, the man with the extraordinary gift who'd saved their evening. At 8:55, Victoria Brennan had been informed of what had happened. She'd arrived for her standard pre-performance warm-up, expecting the piano she'd rehearsed with days ago. Instead, she found an instrument that had been taken apart and reassembled by someone she'd never heard of. James had explained the situation carefully, watching Victoria's expression shift from confusion to concern to curiosity, as he described Darius's intervention. I can assure you, James concluded, Maestro Foster himself tested the piano extensively. He says it's never sounded better. Victoria, professional to her core, approached the Steinway with the analytical focus of someone whose career depended on the instrument responding exactly as needed. She sat, adjusted the bench, and began her warm-up routine. The first scales she played were exploratory testing, listening for any inconsistency or problem. What she heard instead was perfection. The piano responded to her touch with a clarity and resonance that exceeded even her high standards. The action was flawless. The tone was sublime. Every register balanced perfectly with every other. As she progressed through her warm-up, moving into more complex passages from the Rachmaninoff she'd performed tonight, her expression shifted from caution to delight. Who is this person? She asked, when she finished looking at James with genuine wonder. Who is this Darius Webb? He's our janitor, James said. Or at least he has been for 22 years. I think after tonight, that's going to change. At 9 o'clock, the doors opened. The audience began filing into Carnegie Hall, dressed in their concert finest, clutching their programs, buzzing with anticipation for Victoria Brennan's performance. They had no idea how close they'd come to disappointment, had no awareness of the crisis that had been averted just an hour earlier. James Morrison escorted Darius to his seat personally. It was in the orchestra section, row M, seat 108. Not the very front, but close enough to experience the full acoustic glory of the space. As Darius settled into the plush seat, running his hands over the armrests, feeling the space around him filling with people, he felt a sense of belonging he'd never experienced here before. Enjoy the concert, Mr. Webb, James said, his hand briefly touching Darius's shoulder in a gesture of respect and gratitude. You've more than earned this." As the hall filled, Darius listened to the sounds of the audience with his characteristic attention to detail. The rustle of programs, the murmur of conversations, the anticipation building in the space like a physical presence. He heard people taking their seats around him, heard their excitement and expectations. At 9:10, the lights dimmed. The audience settled into expectant silence. Maestro Bernard Foster walked onto the stage, and the applause that greeted him was warm and sustained. He bowed, turned to the orchestra, raised his baton. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 began to fill the hall. For Darius, what followed was transcendent. He'd heard this piece countless times over the years, had memorized every note, every nuance, but he'd never heard it like this. Sitting in the audience, surrounded by other listeners, feeling the music wash over him with full force, it was as if he was experiencing it for the first time. And there was something else, something that made his chest tight with emotion. He could hear his tuning in every note Victoria Brennan played. He could hear the precision of his work, the perfect intervals, the flawless harmonics. This world-renowned pianist was playing an instrument that he, Darius Webb, had prepared for her. His gift, the gift his mother had nurtured and believed in so fiercely, was contributing to this moment of beauty that hundreds of people were experiencing together. When Victoria's hands crashed down in the powerful chords that opened her solo entrance, the sound that erupted from the Steinway was magnificent. The piano sang with a voice that was both powerful and delicate, aggressive and tender, exactly as Rachmaninoff had intended. Victoria's technique was flawless, but the instrument she played was responding to her every touch with perfect precision. In the audience, people leaned forward, captivated. This wasn't just a good performance. This was something special, something that would be talked about for years. The synergy between pianist and instrument was creating magic. Darius listened with tears streaming down his face, unashamed of the emotion he couldn't contain. This was what his mother had wanted for him. Not necessarily fame or recognition, but this, the chance to use his gift to create beauty, to help others to contribute something meaningful to the world. The concerto progressed through its 3 movements, each one more emotionally complex than the last. The famous second movement, with its achingly beautiful melody, seemed to suspend time itself. The final movement built to its thunderous conclusion, Victoria's hands flying across the keys, the orchestra surging behind her, the entire hall caught up in the power and passion of the music. When the final chord sounded and faded into silence, there was a moment of absolute stillness. Then the audience erupted. The applause was thunderous, people rising to their feet, shouting bravos, clapping until their hands hurt. Victoria Brennan stood at the piano and bowed deeply, her face showing the exhilaration of a performance she knew had been extraordinary. Maestro Foster came to stand beside her, taking her hand and raising it high in recognition. The applause continued, wave after wave of appreciation, washing over the stage. Victoria bowed again and again, and each time, the applause seemed to grow rather than diminish. In row M, seat 108, Darius Webb stood with the rest of the audience and applauded. His hands came together again and again, joining in the collective expression of appreciation for beauty, well executed. But his applause was also for something more. It was gratitude for the gift he'd been given, gratitude for his mother, who'd nurtured it, gratitude for the chance to finally use it in a way that mattered. He didn't know it yet, But his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. The transformation that had begun when he stepped forward to help was far from over. Standing there in the applause, still invisible in the crowd, Darius was about to become visible in ways he'd never experienced before. The applause continued for nearly 5 minutes. Victoria Brennan took multiple bows each time, met with renewed enthusiasm from an audience that recognized they'd witnessed something extraordinary. Finally, after her 4th curtain call, she raised her hand for quiet. The crowd gradually settled, curious about what she might say. Victoria had a reputation for rarely addressing audiences directly. She preferred to let her music speak for itself. But tonight was different. Tonight she felt compelled to break her usual pattern. "Thank you," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's perfect acoustics. "Tonight was special for reasons you may not be aware of. Just 2 hours before this performance was scheduled to begin, the piano you heard tonight was damaged. We thought we would have to cancel." A murmur of surprise rippled through the audience. People exchanged glances, processing this revelation. "The reason you heard what you heard tonight," Victoria continued. "The reason this piano sounded as magnificent as it did is because of someone who isn't standing on this stage. Someone who, until tonight, no one really knew possessed an extraordinary gift." She turned to look toward the wings where James Morrison stood. They'd discussed this moment during intermission, after Victoria had learned the full story of what Darius had done. She'd insisted that he be recognized, that the audience know who had made this evening possible. Darius Webb. Victoria called out, "Would you please come to the stage?" In the audience, Darius froze. He heard his name, but couldn't quite process that it was being called from the stage in front of thousands of people. Around him, audience members were looking around, trying to identify who Victoria was calling for. James Morrison appeared at Darius's row. "Mr. Webb," he said gently, taking Darius's arm. "She's calling for you." "The audience wants to see you." "I can't," Darius whispered, panic rising in his chest. I'm just the janitor." "Not anymore," James said firmly. "Come on, you deserve this." With James guiding him, Darius made his way out of the row and toward the stage. The audience, understanding now that the person being summoned had been sitting among them, began to applaud again. The sound grew as Darius was led through the wings and onto the stage itself. Standing on that stage, the place he'd cleaned thousands of times, but never stood on as anything other than maintenance staff, Darius felt exposed and vulnerable. He couldn't see the thousands of faces looking at him, but he could feel their attention, could hear their applause, could sense the magnitude of the moment. Victoria Brennan came to stand beside him, taking his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying pride and warmth, "this is Darius Webb. For 22 years, he has worked at Carnegie Hall as a member of the maintenance staff. What almost no one knew until tonight is that Darius has perfect pitch and the ability to tune pianos with extraordinary precision." She paused, letting that information settle over the audience. "When our Steinway was damaged just hours before this performance, when every professional technician in New York was unavailable, Darius stepped forward and offered to help. In 90 minutes, using only his ears and his remarkable gift, he tuned this $2 million instrument to absolute perfection. Every note you heard tonight, every harmony, every subtle nuance of sound was made possible by this man's extraordinary talent and courage. The applause that erupted now was different. It was louder, more sustained, mixed with shouts and bravos that are usually reserved for performers. The audience rose to their feet again. But this time the ovation was entirely for Darius. Tears streamed freely down Darius's face. His hands trembled. He'd spent 50 years hiding his gift, decades believing it had no purpose, 22 years being invisible in this very building. And now he stood at the center of recognition, acknowledged not for what he couldn't do, but for what he could. Victoria leaned close to speak in his ear, her voice audible only to him over the applause. "Thank you," she said. "This piano has never responded better. What you did tonight was as much artistry as what I just performed. Never doubt that." Maestro Bernard Foster joined them on stage, shaking Darius's hand with genuine warmth and respect. "Mr. Webb," he said, "in 40 years of conducting, I've never seen anything quite like what you accomplished tonight. It was an honor to witness it." Helen Rodriguez appeared from the wings, along with several members of Carnegie Hall's board of directors, who'd rushed over from a dinner meeting when they heard what had transpired. Helen's eyes were bright with emotion as she approached Darius. "Mr. Webb," she said, speaking loudly enough to be heard by the audience on behalf of Carnegie Hall's board of directors, "I want to formally thank you for your service tonight. But I also want to offer you something more." She paused, looking at the board members who nodded their agreement. "Effective immediately, we would like to offer you the position of Associate Piano Technician for Carnegie Hall, a full-time position with benefits working with our master technicians to maintain and prepare our instruments for performances." The audience overhearing this offer erupted in applause again. Someone shouted, "Yes," others clapped and cheered. Darius could barely speak. I don't know what to say," he managed. "Say yes," Helen said with a smile. "Say you'll let us rectify 22 years of not recognizing your true value." "Yes," Darius said, his voice breaking. "Yes, I'll accept. Thank you. Thank you so much." The applause continued as Victoria, Bernard, Helen, and the board members stood with Darius on the stage. Carnegie Hall's social media team, having been alerted to the situation, was already posting about the extraordinary events of the evening. Within hours, the story would go viral. By morning, news outlets across the country would be covering it. Darius Webb, the blind janitor with perfect pitch, who'd saved Carnegie Hall, would become a human interest story that would touch millions. But in that moment, standing on that stage, Darius wasn't thinking about fame or media attention. He was thinking about his mother, Clara Webb, who'd died believing her son's gift would never be fully realized. He was thinking about the old upright piano in their small house in Georgia, the countless hours she'd spent teaching him her unwavering faith that his ability meant something. "I did it, Mama," he whispered too quietly for anyone to hear over the applause. "I finally did what you always said I should. I shared the gift." As the applause finally began to fade, and the evening's official program concluded, audience members didn't immediately leave. They lingered in the halls discussing what they'd witnessed, the extraordinary performance, but also the remarkable story behind it. Many approached staff members to learn more about Darius, to understand how this had happened, to express their amazement at the turn of events. In the green room, Victoria Brennan sat with Darius for a few moments before she had to leave for her next engagement. "I want you to know something," she said seriously. "I've played on pianos tuned by the finest technicians in the world, Steinway's own master technicians, Franz Mohr, who tuned for Horowitz. What you did tonight ranks with the best of them. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." "Thank you," Darius said, still struggling to fully process the evening's events. "That means more than you know." "I'll be back at Carnegie Hall in 6 months," Victoria said. "When I perform again, I want you to be the one who prepares the piano." "Will you do that for me? It would be an honor," Darius replied. As Victoria left, other musicians who'd been in the building that evening came to meet Darius. Concert violinists, cellists, conductors who worked regularly at Carnegie Hall. Each wanted to shake his hand to thank him, to tell him they'd heard what happened, and were amazed. The blind janitor who'd been invisible for 22 years suddenly found himself at the center of an impromptu celebration. James Morrison stood back, watching the scene with satisfaction. He thought about all the times he'd walked past Darius in the hallways, had seen him cleaning or moving his cart, had exchanged brief pleasantries without ever really wondering who this man was beyond his job description. The shame of that oversight mixed with genuine happiness at seeing Darius finally recognized. By midnight, the building was finally quiet again. Most people had left. The evening's energy was settling into memory. Darius sat alone for a moment in the now empty concert hall, back in row M, seat 108, where he'd experienced the concert hours earlier. The silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of being overlooked or invisible. It was the silence of contentment, of something fundamental having shifted in his world. He thought about Monday, when he'd returned to Carnegie Hall, not as a janitor, but as an associate piano technician. He thought about working directly with the instruments he'd only been able to admire from a distance for all these years. But more than that, he thought about purpose. For 50 years, he'd carried a gift that seemed to have no outlet, no practical application, no way to justify its existence beyond being a beautiful but useless ability. Tonight, that had changed. Tonight, his gift had mattered in ways he'd never imagined possible. "Thank you, God," he said quietly into the empty hall. "Thank you for this gift. Thank you for my mother who nurtured it. Thank you for the chance to finally use it the way it was meant to be used." The acoustics of Carnegie Hall carried his words into the space where they resonated and faded like music itself, like a prayer made of sound and gratitude. The following Monday morning, Darius Webb arrived at Carnegie Hall at 9 a.m. for his first day in his new position. He carried the same white cane, walked with the same careful precision, but everything else had changed. James Morrison met him at the employee entrance, but instead of directing him to the maintenance area where he'd reported for 22 years, James led him to a different part of the building entirely. "The technical department is on the 3rd floor, James explained as they walked. "You'll have your own workspace, a full set of professional tuning tools, access to all our instruments, not just the main stage Steinway. There are 3 other pianos in the building, plus various instruments we maintain for visiting performers." They entered an elevator. Darius felt the rise counted the floors by the subtle changes in air pressure and sound, a skill he'd developed decades ago. When the doors opened, James guided him down a hallway that smelled different from the maintenance areas. Less like cleaning products, more like wood polish, and the distinctive smell of piano interiors. "This is Daniel Chang," James said, introducing Darius to Carnegie Hall's master piano technician. "Daniel has been with us for 12 years. He'll be working with you, teaching you our specific protocols and procedures." Daniel's handshake was warm and firm. "Mr. Webb," he said, his voice carrying genuine respect. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. What you did Friday night was extraordinary. I've tuned that Steinway dozens of times, and when I came in Saturday to check your work, I was stunned. It was perfect. Better than perfect, actually. The harmonics you achieved in the upper register were exceptional." "Thank you," Darius said, still adjusting to being praised rather than overlooked. "I'd love to learn your techniques. I'm sure there's much I don't know about modern approaches to piano maintenance. I'm sure we'll learn from each other," Daniel said. "Why don't I show you around? The workspace was everything Darius could have hoped for." A large room with excellent acoustics filled with the tools and equipment of professional piano technology. Daniel described each area in detail, helping Darius build a mental map of the space. There was a workbench for minor repairs, a storage area for various tuning tools and replacement parts, and most importantly, a small upright piano that served as a training and testing instrument. "This is yours to use anytime," Daniel explained. "For practice, for testing new techniques, for whatever you need." Darius ran his hands over the upright piano, feeling the keys, the wood grain, the solid construction. In his small apartment in the Bronx, he had no piano. He hadn't had access to an instrument outside of work for decades. Now he had one available, anytime he wanted. Over the next few weeks, Darius immersed himself in his new role with an intensity that surprised even himself. Daniel proved to be an excellent teacher, and their skills complemented each other perfectly. Daniel had years of technical training and experience with modern tuning technology. Darius had his perfect pitch and an intuitive understanding of harmonic relationships that couldn't be taught. Together, they developed a system that combined the best of both approaches. Daniel would handle the mechanical maintenance and the initial gross tuning using electronic tuners. Darius would then do the fine-tuning by ear, achieving a level of precision that exceeded what technology alone could accomplish. The result was instruments that performed at levels even the experienced musicians noticed and praised. Word of Darius's story had spread far beyond Carnegie Hall. The viral social media posts from the night of Victoria Brennan's concert had been picked up by news outlets. Within days, Darius found himself being interviewed by journalists who wanted to tell his story. NPR did a feature. The New York Times ran a profile. CBS Sunday Morning sent a crew to film him working. The attention was overwhelming at first. Darius had spent his entire life trying not to be noticed, and suddenly everyone wanted to notice him. But he handled it with the same quiet dignity he'd always maintained, speaking thoughtfully about his gift, his mother's influence, and the importance of recognizing potential in unlikely places. The story resonated particularly strongly with disability advocacy groups. Here was a blind man who'd been relegated to menial labor for decades, despite possessing an extraordinary skill simply because people made assumptions about what he was capable of. Darius became somewhat reluctantly a symbol of hidden potential and the cost of overlooking those who are different. Carnegie Hall, to their credit, embraced the teaching moment. Helen Rodriguez worked with diversity and inclusion consultants to examine their hiring and promotion practices. They implemented new policies to ensure that all employees, regardless of position, had opportunities to demonstrate skills beyond their job descriptions. Darius's story became a catalyst for institutional change. On a personal level, the transformation in how people related to Darius was profound. Maria from the box office, who'd worked there for 15 years, now met him for coffee every Tuesday morning before work. They talked about music, about life, about her family, and his past. Other staff members went out of their way to include him in social events. The invisible man had become not just visible, but valued. 3 months after his promotion, Darius received an unexpected phone call. It was from the dean of the Juilliard School, one of the world's most prestigious music conservatories. They wanted to offer him a position as a consultant and occasional guest lecturer for their piano technology program. Students training to become piano technicians would benefit enormously from exposure to his approach and abilities. "I never finished high school," Darius said when the offer was made, uncertainty clear in his voice. "Mr. Webb," the dean responded, "what you have can't be learned in a classroom. It's a gift refined by decades of experience. Our students need to learn from you, not the other way around." He accepted the position. Once a month, he'd travel to Juilliard and work with students demonstrating his techniques, explaining how he heard and thought about tuning answering their questions. The students were invariably amazed, many having never encountered someone with perfect pitch of Darius's caliber. For Darius, teaching was another unexpected joy. His mother had been a teacher, and he found he'd inherited her gift for explaining complex concepts in accessible ways. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Victoria Brennan returned to Carnegie Hall for another performance. As promised, she requested that Darius prepare the piano. He spent an entire afternoon with the Steinway, not just tuning it, but adjusting the action, the dampers, the subtle mechanical elements that affected how the instrument responded. He worked with Victoria's specific requirements in mind, knowing her style, her touch, her preferences from having heard her perform multiple times. When Victoria tried the piano during her rehearsal, she played for several minutes without stopping testing every aspect of the instrument. Finally, she stood up and asked to speak with Darius, who was waiting nearby. "This piano," she said, "has never felt better. Never. The response is perfect. The tone is sublime. I've played Steinways tuned by the most famous technicians in history, and what you've done here ranks with the absolute best." She paused. "But more than that, I want you to know that your story has meant something to a lot of people, myself included. It's a reminder that talent and worth can be found in the most unexpected places if we're willing to actually see people." The concert that night was another triumph, and once again Darius sat in the audience, but this time he sat in the box seats, a guest of honor. Around him were other people whose lives had been touched by his story. Blind musicians who'd been inspired by his success. Advocates for disability rights. Young people who'd read about him and decided to pursue their own hidden talents. After the concert, there was a small reception. During it, Helen Rodriguez pulled Darius aside for a private conversation. "I want to apologize," she said, without preamble. "For 22 years you worked in this building and I never really saw you. I never asked about your life, your skills, your potential. I made assumptions based on your position and your disability. And those assumptions were wrong and harmful. I'm sorry." "You're being too hard on yourself," Darius said gently. "I never gave anyone much reason to look deeper. I kept my gift hidden. I made myself invisible." Maybe Helen acknowledged, but that doesn't excuse the fact that we created an environment where you felt you had to hide. That's on us, on me, and I want you to know we're working to change that. Your story has opened a lot of eyes around here." As the reception wound down and Darius prepared to head home, he took a final walk through the empty concert hall. The maintenance staff was already at work, and he recognized several of them. They stopped to chat with him now, to treat him as a colleague, rather than someone they'd barely acknowledged before. Standing on the stage one more time, Darius thought about the journey that had brought him here. From a small house in Georgia to this world-famous venue. From a child learning piano from his mother to a master technician trusted with instruments worth millions. From invisibility to recognition. But more than any of that, he thought about purpose. For so long, his perfect pitch had seemed like a cruel joke, a gift with no outlet, a talent that served no purpose but to remind him of dreams that had died with his mother. Now he understood that the gift had always had purpose. It had simply been waiting for the right moment, the right crisis, the right opportunity to reveal itself. His mother had been right. Gifts are meant to be shared. Sometimes it takes decades to understand how or to find the courage to step forward when the moment arrives. But when you finally do, when you finally let the gift serve its purpose, the transformation isn't just in how others see you. It's in how you see yourself. Darius Webb was 67 years old. He'd spent most of his life in various forms of invisibility and survival. But standing here now, in Carnegie Hall, finally doing the work he'd been meant to do all along, He felt something he hadn't felt since he was a child, sitting at his mother's piano. He felt complete. The hall's acoustics carried the sound of his footsteps as he walked off the stage and into his new life, where gifts were recognized, where talent mattered more than assumptions, and where a blind janitor with perfect pitch had finally found his way home.